And I literally walked out of my house. My stepfather chased me out with a metal pipe. And I basically never forget that day. My mother stood there, didn't say a word, watched the whole thing unfold. And I had $20 in my pocket. And so I started getting into trouble. I started getting into fights all the time. I started selling drugs. And so, it kind of took a life of its own from there. And
tell us who you are, man, and a little bit about you, man.
yeah, so you already gave my name. I'm Greg Michelman. I live Long Island, New York. I'm born and raised here. I haven't left, although I'm hoping to remedy that sometime in the near future. Yeah, man, I'm just right now, I'm a father of two kids, a husband, a business owner, coaching, all the stuff you mentioned, and I'm loving life. Honestly, it's just things have been good. It didn't start off well in the early years, but with a lot of work, a lot of persistence, here we are, man, just trying to make $1 out of 15 cents and change some lives along the way.
So, dude, you've been in the construction industry for 15 years.
Yep.
And so let's talk a little bit about how you got your start in that, what your childhood was like. And then let's just kind of begin the conversation then. And I want to talk about where you started, where you are now, and everything, what bridged that all together. So let's start with giving them a little bit of background, because you got a great story.
Yeah. So, I mean, in my early childhood, I didn't have it terrible, to be honest. I was basically without a father most of my life, but my mother did, the best job that she could. And in the very early years, it was just my brother and I. And so, she did what she had to. She kept food on the table, kept a roof over our heads, and we lived a fairly, we definitely weren't, we were probably, I wouldn't say lower class, but we weren't middle class either, somewhere stuck in between. But we had everything we needed, and it wasn't terrible. And then somewhere along the line, my mother got remarried, and we ended up in a blended family. So it ended up being total of 6 kids in a house. And it started to get a little tricky for me because, as many of you probably, many of your listeners know, the fact is, first of all, having a father figure or a lack thereof is tough to begin with. Then my stepfather was a very hard worker. I mean, to be honest with you, looking back on my life now, I attest a lot of how I am and how I operate just living under the same roof as him, because he always worked hard. But on the parental side, he kind of dropped the ball a lot. So by the time I was about 12 or 13 years old, things started to change for me. My heart, slowly becoming a man, going through puberty and other things happening, and a million things going on inside my mind. I started acting out like a lot of teenagers do, but I wasn't getting the attention that I needed, because now my mother's time was split, not only between my brother and I, but now 4 other kids that she basically took the responsibility of. And my stepfather was out working pretty much all the time in the same business I'm in now, which is plumbing and heating. So through my teenage years, I had a lot of rough time, a lot of rough patches, a lot of situations that, looking back on it now, I was probably the catalyst of a lot of it. But, as a teenager, what do you really know? You know what your parents are doing, you know what your parents teach you, and you learn from examples. So I had a very rough time when I was a freshman in high school. It's funny because I was in private school in middle school. And I ended up getting thrown out of school. I ended up in the public school system on my freshman year of high school. I remember once I got into this environment around all these different cultures and different people, it really changed my perspective on things. And I started acting like this is when things kind of turned around. I don't know. How's language on here? Can I speak freely, or
just be you, bro?
Some people like it G-rated, but that's just not. I'll try to speak as clean as I can. But things were a little messed up, and I just started this downward spiral from there. I was in sports my whole life, and I loved sports, so I did participate in sports when I first got in high school. But then I started finding the bad crowd, if you want to say. And so I started getting into trouble. I started getting into fights all the time. I started selling drugs. And so, it kind of took a life of its own from there. And probably about the time I was 17 or about 18, I just graduated high school. I ended up thrown out of my house. And the funny thing is, I had a full-time job and I was in college full-time. I didn't really want to go to college. I felt forced into college. It really wasn't for me. I was already blue collar. I was building houses. I was in the construction field from day one. So I built houses at 17 years old. I started with funny story. I don't want to get too much into it, but my real father, who I basically have no relationship with, hired me to work for him. It only lasted like 6 months, and then him and I butt heads, and that was the end of it. But that's how I got my start in the construction world. And I lived blue collar my whole life. Like this running this business thing only happened over the last 4 years. I started GMAC. So I never, other than hustling in the streets, I was a business. So I was an entrepreneur all my life. Like I was the kid that had a lemonade stand on the corner. Like I always was figuring out ways to make money. So I guess in some way, looking back, I was always a little entrepreneurial. Just didn't know what to do with it. But anyway, so at that time, when I found myself out of my house and I literally walked out of my house, my stepfather chased me out with a metal pipe. And I basically never forget that day. My mother stood there, didn't say a word, watched the whole thing unfold. And I had $20 in my pocket. So I'm a teenage boy who pretty much just graduated high school, maybe like a few months after. And I'm on my own and I don't have a pot to piss in. And I was bouncing around from couch to couch to couch. Like I said, I was working for my real father. He gave me a little shitty, rusty van, and I was sleeping in that some nights. Just bouncing around, kind of nomad, and pretty much homeless. So and that happened for a little while, and then finally I got my first apartment. But from the time I was about 18 to probably about 25, I was a mess. I had good friends, but we were just getting into stuff, and I was still could not wrap my head around, doing things the right way. I was learning because now I'm like thrust into the situation where I have to pay my own bills. It's like, this is what the real world is like, huh? I guess I have to pay these things. So it's like you had to start learning that responsibility and having a full-time job, and not only having one, but keeping it. But I bounced around a lot during those years. And those were some of the most pivotal years for me. I mean, I learned some of the hardest lessons, not having places to sleep, not having a normal house to go to every day, or a warm meal. There was times I went without eating for long periods of time. And then I had friends that would bail me out of those situations. And it just went on like that for a while, honestly, just kind of like chasing my tail a little bit. The years get a little bit fuzzy because everything kind of just blends into one. But somewhere around my 24th, 25th birthday, I think I finally found, in that time frame, a guy that I worked for, a contractor, who happened to be family, but it was like one-off family. It wasn't like he was like a third cousin or something, but he hired me and really took me under his wing. And he was like one of the first people that was like a male, like father figure-ish to me, who kind of taught me about how important it is not only to be responsible and show up to work and work. I always had work ethic. That's a funny thing though. I don't know if I learned that early. Like whenever I had a job, I showed up on time. Like I was never that guy. Like I worked late. I never complained, and I always worked hard, but it was just finding that place that I felt right to be in. That was really hard. And then, so this guy took me under his wing, and between him and his brother, I worked for them for probably the next handful of years. And they taught me a lot. It wasn't just about construction. I did learn a lot about building houses, but I learned how to be a man. I learned how to show up. I learned how to stop off. I learned how to really I rounded my life out. And I'm skipping things because it's like all over the place. But to take a step back a little bit, in that time frame, I connected back with my parents. And this is a funny lesson that I tell a lot of people. It's a lesson that I'm still learning, but it's hard to patch up problems with people, problems with family, until you're willing to patch up yourself. So it was really the beginning stages of working on me. And so as I started to accept the fact that I was a problem too, and not just blaming them for everything that happened, because for a lot of years, for a long stretch of time, I spent most of my time bitching about the fact that they put me out of the house. I never once looked internally and said, yeah, I was kind of not being the child that parents, want to raise in their home. And once I accepted that, and so we had sat down and we kind of just made amends for the stuff that happened in the past, but we really didn't build on the relationship much, little bits, because my family, outside of the situation with them and myself at those times, we're the type of family that got together multiple times a year. It wasn't family reunions, but holidays and things like that. We got together and we spent time. And so I was kind of the outsider. So around that same time, I did start coming to the house. The first time I was like invited back to the house. Like I wasn't allowed to go back to the house after everything happened. So the first time I was like invited back, spend time with family. And so we started making a better connection. And I got a job as a superintendent of a building around this time. And I thought it was like the golden goose. I knew the guy. He's like, don't worry, you can live the life you want to live. Just make sure your building's clean. But he sold me a bill of goods. And I was like, oh, that's great. But I also smoked a lot of weed. And I was young. I'm in my 20s. Like anybody who knows a super, like that's a full-time job. The work never stops. You have to be around the building. So I was sold a bill of goods. Long story short, about a year after that, I got fired from that job. And so I was basically jobless and homeless again because they gave me an apartment. So I was back to, okay, renting. How can I find an apartment? I got to find a job. So at that time, I was just scrambling. I reached out to everybody I knew that was still in construction, and I was like patching my week. So I'd like work 2 days with this guy and 2 days with that guy, 1 day with this guy, patching a week's worth of work. So, and then at that time, like I said, as I'm bridging the gap with my parents, my stepfather is in the business I'm in now, which was plumbing and heating, which I said earlier. And he actually called me and we had a lunch. It was the first time in my entire life that him and I sat face to face across the table from each other and had a conversation. I've never, like, he talked to me when I was growing up in the house, but he was always a to me. I don't know what it is. I still to this day really never pinpointed it. Some people say he saw a lot of himself in me, so he treated whatever. It doesn't matter. I'm not going to get into psychology about it now, but we're sitting across from each other and he offers me to come into the business and he's going to teach me the business. And listen, as a 24-year-old kid, 25-year-old kid, that's huge opportunity. I was very skeptical because of our relationship, but at the same time, I'm like, what am I doing? Like I'm patching days together. I don't have a full-time gig. I need to start getting my life moving. So I agreed to jump in with him. He helped me out with a couple of little things to help me out financially. Cause listen, when you're that age and I didn't have money for a long time. So I used credit cards and got myself into a little bit of debt and whatnot. And so I got into this business. And so for the first year it was all right. And then the second year was, you could just see him and I never fixed any of the problems we had. And it reared its head fairly quick. But I also learned a lot about, like, that's one thing for me. When it comes to my hands, I learn quick. Like if you put me on a project and I don't know it, by the end of a couple of days, I could pretty much do the job. Like I've always been talented enough to do that. So when I came into his business, as he started to teach me, I was absorbing. By the third year I worked for him, it all went to shit. He was taking money out of my paycheck, saying I wasn't working enough, and it just went to shit. And I left him and I went to work for another company. But at this point, I'm in this stage of my life. Like my wife and I had met each other already. She kind of was with me in the beginning of this whole boiler, like getting into the plumbing and heating business. And so, we were structuring our life and putting, getting our family right. But with a lot of twists and turns with her too, because a lot of my mental issues, kind of came into our sphere and it made it really difficult to operate as a family. And so I had to give up a lot of mental shit. I had to shed a lot of mental issues over that time to make things right with her. But fast forward now, I started my company about 4 years ago. And so about 6 years ago, I got into my first mastermind. And that was really the biggest eye-opening experience of my whole life, because I had been around the same, like, and I'm sure you can attest this. Like, I'm sure people listening to this can. You grow up in a town, you don't leave the town, and it's the same people. It's the same thing. You tend to go to the same restaurants. You go to the same coffee shops. You go to the same places. It's like you can't break the monotony ever. It's just constant. And so when I found my first mastermind and I met people that were outside of this network, that were business minded, entrepreneurial. The funny thing is the first mastermind I joined was more mindset for me. I had a lot of mindset issues. I hadn't fixed any of I didn't really do work on repairing relationships that I had. I didn't do any hard work on any of those things. So I had to dive deep into me and fixing myself. That was one of the first things. Like I had to heal me before I could heal anything with anybody else. So I went deep and dark and like worked them. And so I went to psychologists my whole life. I don't give a shit how many psychologists I went to go see. My coach at that time did more for me in the shortest period of time than any psychologist ever would, because first of all, I'm very hard. So I like somebody to yell at me. I almost like, if I was in the military, I'd be perfect because I wouldn't give a shit if a drill sergeant screamed at me. It's like, I probably need this shit, right? Like if you're yelling at me, I probably need it. And like, this is how I learn. So My first coach was Sean Whalen, and I was in the Lions then, and many of you who may know who he is, he's a very aggressive guy, but he got through to me. It was like every one of us has that person that strikes that chord. You know, it's like you could hear something 1,000 times, and it's that one person that says it, and they may say it different, or they may say it exactly the same, and it just a light bulb goes off in your brain, and everything seems to become clear. So that's kind of what happened with me there. And I just started to go to work on myself, man. And I fixed all the broken relationships. And what I mean fixed, some of them I mended fences. Some of them is just, I appreciate you. We don't have to have anything else. Mentally, I'm good. Like I don't need you in my life. You can be in my life. We could do this however you want to do it, and I'm okay with it. And so and that was really the start of my journey, man. And now, fast forward 6 years later, and here I am. We met through our mastermind Apex, and man, it's just been a deep dive on me. I just didn't do any work on myself. Like I was constantly chasing. When you're homeless and you don't have money and it's hard to eat and you keep bouncing around, it's very hard to like strap in and try to figure yourself out. Like I'm just trying to navigate life. And then so it's like once I was able to kind of hop in and navigate me, life changed.
Man, dude, man, there's like, dude, you've got a podcast, man. We're gonna let people know about that podcast, man, too, but because it's a good one. But man, it's there's like as a host of this show, man, I've heard freaking 30 directions, man, that I'd love to go to each one of them, man. This is really good, man. Um, you know, it's so you really, this started, man, the awareness part started with you where you were like, I got to do this, man. The therapist or whatever hasn't really done any good for me. And 6 years ago, you got connected with Sean or his group, and Sean landed with you because he was aggressive. And then that, so how old are you now? You're in your 40s, right?
I turned 40 in December. Yeah.
Yeah. So man, this is 6 years ago. So this was 34. So
Yep.
when you took the job or your dad and you went and had stepdad, and you went and had that lunch and you guys connected, you had trouble with your parents and you really hadn't started to work on Greg yet.
Nope.
You were, so, a lot of times, man, it's crazy, man. We don't see it. And you were, I think with younger people, man, because I know I went through all of this. I mean, our stories, you're in New York, dude, I'm in Texas, and our stories might as well be the same, different, details, but
Right.
the story, man, is the
Mhm.
same. And so it's very interesting to me. But what you said a second ago about when you're trying to survive and you're trying to get, and you're worried about, I think about this with single moms a lot, man. Because they're trying to pay their bills, man, and people say, just work on yourself, just pull your bootstraps up or whatever and make it happen, and think positive and be grateful and all this stuff. And they're going, man, I can't even afford diapers, man. I can't even afford to do, what are you talking about? I mean, the car doesn't even work. I mean, what how do I even start? And so I find that very interesting, man, because when we come on these shows and we talk about all this stuff, man, I've been there, dude, when I had to literally count pennies, man, so I could buy a Little Caesars pizza. And it hadn't been that long ago.
Yeah.
So man, what was the first thing when you started realizing, what made you, first of all, have the guts, man, to join the mastermind, man? What was it? What was going on in your mind at that time? And because that's a hard thing to do for people, to invest in themselves when they've never done it before.
Well, truth be told, I found podcasts. I didn't even know what a podcast was, but I found podcasts about a year before that. And so actually my wife's father put me on to the MFCEO project, which is was Andy Frischella's show. Now it's Real AF, whatever, but same thing. And so I started listening because he was doing a little bit of both on that show. Yeah, it was very business oriented, and being that, because what the part of the story I didn't tell you is that when I left my family's business, I went to work for another company for 3 years. They gave me a lot of training. And then my stepfather again was like, he hurt himself on a job and they were really thin on employment and he was getting closer to retirement. So they approached me again, and we had been mending the fence over those few years because I started getting, my own knowledge from somebody else. So I ended up full circle coming back to work for them. And I worked for them for another 3.5 years until I started my company. And he ended up selling the company out from under me. That's a whole nother part of the story, that a whole bunch of other fuckery. But the point is, I came back to work for them. And during that time, I was being groomed supposedly to take over the business. So I started reading business oriented books. And so I found this MFCEO project. And in that, he did a lot of mindset stuff. He's big on mindset. And so it was a mixed bag, but I wasn't getting coaching. I was and I wasn't, because I was just listening to every show. I went back to the beginning, started from his first episode and listened to every episode, because now I'm getting a mixed bag of entrepreneurship, growing a business, the best ways to do that. But I was also getting a little bit of that mindset, engagement that I needed, because I still had so many demons that were just trapped. And I'll tell you another funny story, and people might laugh at this, but I have a tattoo on my ribs. It really never came out the way I wanted it to, because I could have went to a better artist. But the premise behind it was my inner demons. It was an inner demons tattoo. It's pictured as actual demons coming through my rib cage. And it was like, that was trapped inside of me for years. And so this was the beginning of my healing process, was listening to this guy whose passion is exactly what I was telling you I vibe with, he's super passionate, really into what he's doing. And I felt it through the microphone or through the speakers. So, and then he started talking about Sean, and then one thing leads to another. And I started following Sean on social media. And then I heard about the Den. And then even with that, like, for your listeners, like, I remember $147 was what I pay. I still pay. I'm still in it. He might even drop the price, but regardless, I remember looking at that dollar amount still being like, man, that is a big number. Like, I've never, like, my gym cost me $30 a month. Like, I had never put money into myself like that. Like, that was a big commitment for me at that time. And then I didn't pull the trigger, and I let it sit for another 2-3 months. I just didn't do it right away. I was like, I was scared. All the things we feel, it's like, it comes over you, and so then fast forward 3 months later, I said, you know what? I'm in a spot. I need this.